Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is a talk about Sally Gearhart, a documentary film in progress, and it's very nice to have you here. I'm going to be telling you a little bit about who I am, a little bit about who Sally Gearhart is, for those of you who haven't heard of her, and I'm going to be telling you a little bit about the documentary film in progress about Sally Gearhart. First off, who am I? My name is Deborah Craig. I've been teaching for 10 plus years in the public health department at San Francisco State, but I'm also a filmmaker, and I'm making a documentary film about Sally Gearhart. It has been a little bit of a wild ride making this film project, but very, very exciting as well. So I'm going to be telling you about that experience, and also I'm going to be focusing a lot on this film's connection to San Francisco State. So who is Sally Gearhart? Some of you may know a lot about who Sally is. Some of you may have known her in person. Some of you may never have heard of her and may know nothing at all about her. Here's a picture of me and Sally. I feel lucky to have met her and spent some time with her. And to me, one of the fascinating things about her is this fact that some people know about her, in fact, really look up to her and see her as somebody that was very, very important. And some people know nothing about her. So that puzzle is something that to me makes her very, very interesting. She's almost like an icon who only a few people know about, or only a certain group of people know about. And that group might be lesbians from a certain time and a certain place, or people who are at San Francisco State at a certain time and a certain place. Another little thing I want to point out is that even if you've heard nothing about Sally Gearhart, if you're interested in gay rights, if you're interested in feminism, you're interested in brilliant women who have a strong sense of social justice and fairness, and a fantastic sense of humor too, stick around and you'll learn more about somebody I think you'll want to know about. How did I meet Sally? Again, a San Francisco State connection. So I got my master's in public health at San Francisco State in 2009. And then a few years after that, I was working with Mickey Eliason from the public health department on a study of the health of older lesbians. And Mickey got some great funding from the Office on Women's Health. And we were collecting data on women and looking at weight and health. But what happened is I met so many really interesting, fascinating women. I thought I wanted to make a film about lesbians and aging. And I started that process in about 2014. Through that process, I heard about a woman in her 80s living on women's land in Northern California. Now, a couple of things jumped out at me from that. One, I had heard back in the day about women's land, but I didn't really know it still existed. I thought it was something back from the 70s and 80s, maybe. And then the other thing, I heard this woman, the rumor had it that she was in her 80s, living on her own, and she still cut her firewood with a chainsaw. So that I really, really wanted to see. So I started packing my bags, okay? So I drove up to Northern California with my camera woman, Sylvia, and we met Sally, a brilliant, lively, 83-year-old who spent a lot of time, a couple of days really with us, sharing her insights, answering questions. And when we asked her to give us a tour, we ended up in the back of her battered Jeep with her dog, Bodhi, who occupied the front seat. And in the back, there were no seats at all. So we were kind of rattling around back there on these bumpy dirt roads. But we learned a lot. And what we did find out is this woman, Sally, very unassuming, but very welcoming, and living in the woods, about a half an hour out of the town of Willits, had actually made a huge contribution to feminism and LGBTQ history in her day. And we started to realize not enough people knew about her, and we thought that was wrong. So I finished up the shorter documentary I was doing on lesbians and aging, and that's available. It's called A Great Ride. Reach out to me if you're interested. And then right after that, started doing a longer feature documentary about Sally herself. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you our film trailer. Hopefully it's about 4.5 minutes, and I'm hoping it'll give you a sense of Sally's personality and her contributions.
I'm sorry. I just caught our camera woman and she's smiling. It's fun having her behind the camera. Have you noticed that? Okay,
absolutely.
Good. Oh, she's on her knees. God, I haven't had a woman on her knees for me for a long time.
This is Sally Gearhart.
And would you like for me to hold the camera for you? She is a force of nature.
Here come the lesbians. Here come the leading lesbians.
There are those people apparently who question the health and the beauty and the naturalness and the strength of same-sex relationships. And all I've got to say is I wish they were here today.
She reminded me of Maya Angelou, the way she would just wrap you into her words.
The woman just exuded charisma. Everything about her was as glamorous as a radical lesbian could be,
She just had it. And we all fell in love with her.
It was such an exciting time, the 70s and this feminist burst. There was the big word patriarchy.
It was before women's studies really had started anywhere.
And here was this powerful woman, Sally, who gave women great powers in her writing and in her thinking.
She also really wanted women-only space. A lot of us did.
Women's land, right? And so I came to California with the dream of having land like that.
Are you a lesbian separatist?
Radical, lesbian, feminist, separatist, italicized.
Yeah.
In a classic case of life imitating art, Sally co-founded a women's land community at the same time that she was writing a futuristic sci-fi novel that became a cult hit called The Wonderground.
Had a friend come from the East Coast searching for Sally Gearhart of the Wonderground. So the book is a fantasy about women with all kinds of psychic powers living on the land and flying and teleportation, the whole works.
Sally was way ahead of her time in connecting the dots. She's a visionary.
She helped change history. I think she was seen by a lot of people as a major spokesperson for the gay community.
Overwhelmingly, it is true that it's the heterosexual men, I might add, who are the child molesters.
I believe that's a myth. I've never seen...
senators, the FBI, the National Council on Family Relations, the Santa Clara County Child Sexual Abuse Treatment Center, and on and on and on.
Sally Gearhart, at a particular moment in our history, when it really mattered, she stepped up and she inspired tens of thousands of people, articulated the dreams of millions. She's an extraordinary woman.
By now I found myself wondering, why haven't I ever heard about Sally Gearhart?
Here we go, girls.
My attempt to find out.
Hold on to each other's hands. We are encouraging relationships among women.
Turned out to be a pretty wild ride.
Sorry about that, girls. We're going to be okay.
Deborah Craig, she was handed a puzzle, and it was up to her to untangle it.
I hope you enjoyed that trailer, and we're going to move on now. I think the trailer is really aimed at showing something of Sally's spirit and something of the power of her voice at her heyday, her real heyday. Now, it's important to point out that I met her much later in life, so she was already in her early 80s. But when she was in San Francisco, at San Francisco State and San Francisco in the 70s and 80s, that was really her heyday in many ways. So I hope that trailer showed you her sense of fun and adventure. And we really did think we might fall out of the back of her Jeep, but we survived. I kind of blocked the door. And also her wonderful warmth and sense of humor, and a little bit her sense of self-deprecation as well. That trailer also hopes to show that she played a key role in the battle for gay rights, and she's really up there with Harvey Milk as a figurehead, even though she hasn't gotten the recognition that she deserves. And that trailer also touched a little bit on women's land and this separatist community that Sally and many of her friends created for themselves. And that in itself is a fascinating topic that, bears delving into. Separatism really was problematic in terms of, in many ways, being a space for white women and women who could afford to buy land, although land was very affordable at that time. But also in many ways that I learned a lot more about in the process of making the film, was really played a crucial role in lesbians' ability to liberate themselves by stepping away from what was really keeping them from coming into their own as their true selves. And another key thing is that San Francisco State, not just gay rights activism, but her role at San Francisco State was really, really key during that period that we might want to call Sally's heyday, although she had many heydays. Okay, so the San Francisco State connection is a very, very strong thread through much of the film. As I've mentioned, I teach here. I met Sally, heard about Sally, and met Sally through a San Francisco State connection while I was working on a project at San Francisco State. My camera woman also was in the cinema program at the time, and in fact, I had gotten into film when I was in my Master's of Public Health program through a program, Documentary for Health and Justice, Health and Social Justice, that connected cinema students and public health students. I'm not just connected with our public health department, but have gotten a lot of support from our wonderful cinema department at San Francisco State. And Sally herself had a very long history at San Francisco State. She taught at San Francisco State for about 20 years and had a very key role here. And the picture on the right shows San Francisco State. Just before Sally got here, there was a huge strike in the late 60s, a protest about basically the lack of minority enrollment, lack of minority faculty. And that was the beginning of the creation of the Ethnic Studies Department at San Francisco State, and also the beginning of the real radicalization of the school. So Sally herself at San Francisco State, so she was born in 1931. She grew up in Virginia, went to school in Virginia, and then went on to graduate school. At the time, that was a big deal for a woman to not get married right away, but to go on to graduate school. But she taught in Texas for many years. She grew up in a rural environment, a conservative environment, a Christian environment, and taught through the late 60s in Texas in a very conservative environment as well. And that just For so many reasons, she found a way to break away from that and came to San Francisco in the early 70s. And she was a powerful force both at San Francisco State and in San Francisco and California communities through the 70s into the early 90s. It's hard to emphasize enough how much that was a time of excitement and change. Some of you may have been there and experienced that, and for those of you who didn't, weren't born until well after that, or didn't experience or haven't read about it, it was a time of social change in so many areas. The civil rights movement was still going on. There was a huge, powerful anti-war movement against the Vietnam War. Feminism was blooming. Gay rights, were really blossoming. And so Sally just landed in the right place at the right time for her. And she really, as I said before, played a huge role in gay rights, but actually had a foot in a lot of these different movements. She had a foot in feminism and a foot in gay rights, and had a lot of other interests in terms of social justice as well. So she really found herself in her element there, and her background in both in her education and her teaching before she got to San Francisco State had been in theater and in communication. So when she came to San Francisco State, she very first joined the speech and communications department. Soon after that, though, Sally was a part of a team of really powerhouse women who created one of the first women's studies departments in the country. Very first, before it was even a department, it was a program. So they were drawing, since they didn't have an official department. These women got together, Nancy McDermott, who was taught in the communication department and was also a dean of humanities. Jane Gurko was in the English department, and many others who started to figure out how to draw women from different departments to create a program, whether they called it women's studies, whether they called it, as you can see here, some schedules that I found in the archives where they called it Focus on Women. They really pulled together an interdisciplinary department to have courses about women, whether looking at literature, looking at history, looking at philosophy, and so on. And Sally taught a lot of very popular courses in this program: patriarchal rhetoric, rhetoric of sexual liberation, and people are still studying the way that what was called then the patriarchy, what now might be called, and sexism now might be called toxic masculinity. The way in which language had a huge impact, and so on. So that was a time of real excitement and transformation for Sally and her colleagues, and also for the students in those departments. We tend to think, oh, women's studies, that's just an option, of classes you can take or a department you can be in. And really, it's very easy to forget that it's not that long ago there was no such thing. Another thing that I've found out from learning more about the Women's Studies program, which later became the Women's Studies Department and is now as Women and Gender Studies Department at San Francisco State, a great department that does a lot of excellent work, is there. I've talked to faculty in that department and many former students from that department, and two things that stood out to me were these ideas of egalitarianism and activism. And so, we tend to think of San Francisco State and a lot of other universities as a fairly non-hierarchical place. But back in the day, when the Women's Studies program was being created, I think they were really pushing in a very powerful way to really meet those ideals rather than just pay lip service to them. And so I've talked to students there who were involved in not only faculty meetings, but in hiring decisions. Well, I love my department. I love San Francisco State. I've been a lecturer at San Francisco State for probably 10 plus years. I've never been asked to be on a hiring committee, even though I've heard the word equity and social justice many, many times. I've never been asked to be on a hiring committee. So maybe we're backsliding a little bit. I hope not. But I was very, very impressed to hear the way in which students were drawn into not just into the conversation, but into the decision-making process at that time. And the deep commitment to not just talking about social change, but practicing it in the department. And another story illustrates that fact. If you've heard of Angela Davis, which I hope many of you have, some of you may not have, in which case look her up right away. She was a very powerful force in activism in the 60s and 70s, is still teaching at Santa Cruz. Now she may be retired, but she had been banned from teaching in the UC system because of her radical politics. And the San Francisco State Women's Studies faculty and students banded together and decided that they wanted to bring in Angela Davis to the Women's Studies department, that it was the right thing to do. She had the power and the voice that would make sense in that department. So they came together and made it happen. And it was a battle. It wasn't an easy hire. And in some ways it may have paved her way to gone on to a fruitful academic career. The second theme that I really stood out to me in the early formation of that Women's Studies department is activism. And again, true activism, not just talking about the importance of activism, but practicing that. And so a lot of faculty were maybe activists and community organizers that taught a class, or maybe taught a class or two. And some, like Sally, were full-time faculty, but were engaged in social movements and were very actively engaged in the push for social change. And so there was a back and forth and an ebb and flow and a really powerful interchange on what was happening on campus and what was happening out in the real world and in the various pushes for social change that was happening. So Sally's activism took many forms, and most people who do know anything about her know about her involvement in the Briggs fight against the Briggs Initiative, Proposition 6, and that was in the late 80s, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. She was also involved in something called the Council on Religion and the Homosexual. As mentioned, she had been very involved in the church in her earlier life, and she gradually moved away from that. But before she did that, she was involved in this very progressive council of religious folks who were trying to push the church to be more accepting. At certain points, Sally started writing about the church in ways that were very, very radical. It's hard to tell with her sometimes if things are real or tongue-in-cheek or a little bit of each, but she would say things like, I'm looking forward to the death of the church so we can start practicing the gospel. And she talked a lot about the patriarchal formation of the church and how the church keeps women down. And so she did gradually move away from the church. But before she did, she was sort of trying to blow up the church from the inside in some ways. She was also very concerned about animal rights and about environmentalism. And so she had a lot of interests. But again, she put a lot of her energy at a certain point in time in fighting for gay rights in this particular homophobic initiative in California. And again, I worry, and I'm not meaning to point the finger in any way, but I do know that in the academic community, there's so much focus on publishing, on doing research, and cost of living is so expensive, and we're so busy with our lives that sometimes a little bit of that activist spirit feels like it's hard to keep that spark going. And I know I find it inspiring to look back at Sally's days on campus and talk to other people from that time, to what the lengths to which they were going to push for positive change. So here's a little bit more about the Briggs Initiative that Sally played a key role in, for those of you who don't know. So the Briggs Initiative would have banned gay people from working in the California public schools in any capacity, from teaching on down or up. And it's shocking for us to think about it this time. And I think especially for young people to think about a time where it was not only not socially acceptable to be gay, but you really put your work life at risk and sometimes your life at risk to be a gay person. And so for Sally, this was personal because she had been a teacher her whole life. That was her career. It really was her calling in so many ways. So she jumped in there and wholeheartedly decided to help out, and was connected with Harvey Milk, and they became figureheads. It was very purposeful that they had a male figurehead and a female figurehead, because the whole No on 6 campaign was based on showing that it was both men and women. And it was also based on an egalitarian ideal of having both men and women participating in the movement and spearheading the movement. So Sally and Harvey spoke together all over the state. They participated in a debate on California television, KQED television, where debated Briggs. Briggs was the guy who started that initiative. And they kicked his butt, in particular Sally. And one thing to know about Sally is not just that she was really smart, but she was trained. She was trained in theater. She was trained in communication. She was a trained debater. She was a trained debate coach. And she just eviscerated Briggs and his opponent. And again, it was personal for her. She had taught for many, many years. She was at the peak of her teaching career, involved in creating women's studies programs. And she also had come to California to come out, and in Texas had been closeted and had suffered from that, and she was not about to go back. So she had a very powerful influence. And there's some folks who say Sally motivated us, and Sally helped change people's minds. And so I think we underestimate her role. That's our loss and our peril. And again, unfortunately, it's too often that we've written women out. So here's an interesting thing. So that's Sally at her apex, but our film is a very ambitious one, and we're really hoping to look at her whole life trajectory, not just Sally sort of at the height of her fame and the height of her powers, but what happened earlier in her life? Where did she come from? And then what happened later in her life? Where did she go when she retired and in some ways disappeared off the radar screen? So to help you understand that, I'm just going to tell you a teeny bit about the way documentaries are made. And I sometimes use a quilt metaphor, sometimes use a puzzle metaphor, probably many other metaphors that will work, that those work for me. But the way documentaries are different from most films is that most fictional films, you create a script, you map out ahead of time the story that you want to tell, and then you create the pieces that can tell that story. Well, documentary is very different. You may have a really good idea of the story you want to tell, but then you kind of go on this big quest or big fishing expedition to find those puzzle pieces, and they may not be what you expect. You might not find what you're hoping to, or what you want, or what you expected to. And you might find some other treasures that you had no idea about, but you were lucky enough to find. And so you take what you have and you construct a map or a puzzle or a quilt with those pieces that you've found, okay? And so we've had a whole long journey finding those puzzle pieces and then constantly kind of changing our map or our idea of what we're going to do. So it's been a big adventure for us. and a long and complicated journey because Sally is not a one-dimensional person. So I sometimes tell people we're trying to make a film a little bit like a recent film that was made about Dolores Huerta, who was a farm worker, worked with farm workers alongside Cesar Chavez, and had a really seminal role in that movement, but was not given the recognition she's due. So Dolores Huerta was a brilliant and powerful person who's still doing the work, but she had one focus. Sally had so many. Sally was interested in communication. She was interested in theater. She was interested in feminism. She was interested in gay rights. She was interested in speculative fiction. She wrote fantasy novels. She was interested in the land and land communities. She came from a background of religion and kind of left the church, but maintained a spiritual outlook and an interest in spirituality. And she knew so many people, many of them just as brilliant and as fascinating as herself. So our puzzle and our quilt have gotten bigger and bigger and more complicated as we go along. And then sometimes things seem like they're going to fit and work beautifully together, and sometimes things complicated and complex and contradictory. And that is just A, part of human nature, B, especially part of the way Sally operated. She seemed perfectly comfortable in her contradictions. She was a separatist, which meant a lesbian who was particularly interested in being in community with other women. And she loved a lot of men too, and she had men friends for decades, and she embraced them and learned from them, and they learned from her. And she was an environmentalist, and she lived on junk food and Pepsi and so on and so on. So one friend of hers told me, Sally sometimes said, I live in Northern California on a mountain of contradictions. And I love that because it's funny. It shows her deprecating sense of humor. So here's what our quilter puzzle is looking right at the moment. Is that one, and it's fairly common, it's not required, but it's one way of approaching documentaries also is, again, not to have a script, but to have a structure or a narrative arc, and sometimes which falls into 3 acts or chapters or whatever you might want to call them. And so currently what we're looking at is this, until the next time we change what we're doing, depending on what comes in. We're currently looking at Act 1, really Sally at the height of her fame, teaching at San Francisco State, leading the charge against the Briggs Initiative, and really at the height of her fame and influence. From there, so we're kind of starting in the middle in a way, not starting at the beginning. And in a way, when you meet people, that's not how many stories are told. That's not usually how history is told. But that's usually how we get to know people, is we get to know them when we meet them, and then we learn about their past. So then what we're going to do in Act 2 is we are going to go backpedal and go back into that backstory to try to find out, how did this person come about? Where did Sally come from? How did she get to be who she is? And so we actually had the incredible opportunity to go back to Sally's hometown. She grew up in small town Virginia, in a little town on the West Virginia border, very Christian, very conservative. And her brother, half-brother, still lives right near where she grew up. So we got a tour of the town and we got a chance to interview him. And so that was really, really fascinating to get a little sense of where she came from, and also what an incredible trajectory her life took to end up on the other side of the country and on the other side of the political spectrum in so many ways as well. And then Act 3, we kind of come back to the present and then go on from there. When I met Sally, she was already towards the end of her life in what we're looking at as Act 3 in her later years. And part of the puzzle for me was, how did she end up here? Here's somebody who should have been, in the history books. And she's living in a little rustic cabin in the woods outside of a small town where people in the town know her, but people taking queer history or, learning about Harvey Milk don't necessarily know about her. So what happened? So in those later years, those were rewarding years for her. She might have been off the radar for a lot of people, but she looks as though she may have moved there because she wanted small town life. She grew up in a small town. She ended up in a small town. She grew up where she knew everybody. She ended up where she pretty much knew everybody in town. And she created a women's community in Northern California that really thrived for many, many years, but gradually just fell apart little by little. Women moved away, women died, women ended up feeling not so capable of living in the woods and maybe off the grid in their later years. So Sally was very hardcore about that. She wanted to stay there. She wanted to stay in her cabin. She liked being out in nature, but she grew more and more isolated. And the last few years I was visiting her, I was concerned, was she able to live there on her own? Was her community crumbling around her? Were her finances okay? Was her health okay? And those were some of the main concerns I had and was exploring in her later years. And the other thing was just, is she relevant now to all of us? And I think I was also really interested, is she interesting and relevant to young queer people who are looking back at their history, but also looking forward to somebody who might be a role model for the new battles that we're fighting today. Times have changed. Maybe they'll change back, but I haven't met that many young lesbians or queer people or non-binary folks, trans folks, etc., who are dying to move out into the woods and make a life there. And so our challenge, among other things, was not just to figure out who Sally is, but how she strikes a chord with us now and feels relevant now. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is play a scene from Act 3, which is at the end of Sally's life, and then I'll go on to wrap up and we'll talk a little bit more about how and why we really think Sally has a message for us. Not just about what important things she did in the past, but she has a message for us now. Oh, it's rain falling in my car. It's fucking pouring, and we're going out into the woods. So what is up with Sally? A lot of people say they don't know. Even to have people say, well, I haven't seen her in 20 years, or I haven't seen her in 5 years. What is going to happen to her? Here's somebody who was this brilliant woman who worked hard her whole life, and now she's in this precarious situation. Okay, here we go.
Sally would never admit to it on camera, but the more I visited her on women's land, the clearer it became that her utopia was crumbling.
You are filming me putting on these.
Yeah. None of us are living there full time now, except for Sally. None of us. It's shocking. Could be as many as 10 years that I haven't been there. I'm going to let that rest right there.
She doesn't really know everything, but she knows how all my friends have abandoned me.
That is not what the Wonderground promised.
And where's my...
You're looking at me.
I'm looking at you, okay.
What had happened? It seemed almost impossible to untangle the tension and drama swirling around Sally's situation. But everything pointed to a pivotal moment when things changed.
And I'm fucking this up pretty bad, huh?
One weekend while we were filming, we stumbled upon a clue.
No, I think that was great.
We might come back later this afternoon.
I'm sorry?
We're going to go see Carol Orton, depending on how long.
How come you're going to go see Karen Orton?
Carol's going to talk about the land.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be nosy. I just wanted to know what.
She says
what
to say hi.
Okay.
Yeah.
Carol Orton was Jane's lover.
Sally and I became partners. We then separated and became friends and family, and Carol entered my life, and she has been partnering with me on the land that I still co-own with Sally.
Sally was invited to come and meet me by Jane, because Jane had made it clear to me that if there was going to be any relationship with her, Jane, I would need to know who Sally was and have kind of passed some kind of something between Jane and Sally.
Problems, though.
Problems.
We have had problems.
Some of the problems come because of boys. Who knows about this? New lovers with sons.
Jane did the unthinkable thing of partnering up with somebody with 2 sons, not just 1, 2.
Janie met them, and that's really who she fell in love with.
She, unlike Sally, really wanted to have kids.
And when I first got together with Jane, before we were even together, when we first even were having little dinners together, she explained that this was women's land and that there was a chance that, it would not be appropriate for my children to come here.
That was a big discussion, many times. And I didn't know what it all meant, really. I truly didn't.
It actually doesn't mean no men or no boys.
No.
What it means is we want the land to continue to be owned and controlled by women.
Mm-hmm.
Early on, no, she was really vociferously not interested in having boys on the land at all.
They were the first and probably forever the only male children who were welcome there.
Being a young man, I would say a boy mostly, on women's land in that period of time was very difficult at times.
I wanted to read you something from the future, if there is one, as female, and then we can talk about it.
Oh my God.
The ratio of men to women must be radically reduced so that men approximate only 10% of the total population.
I have had to answer for that. So many times. This came because I studied the Amazons one time.
Was Sally serious when she said she wants to get rid of all men? At times, yeah, I think so.
We fought about the role of men. I couldn't go along with Sally wanting men to jump off the edge of the earth.
Jane wasn't having it.
Jane came to me at one point and said, I'd like to just check in with, I feel like I want to be known as a godmother, a real parent. They will be my inheritors. I said, okay.
Change and decay.
Jane's death absolutely rocked Sally. And she's grieving the loss of her best friend and the most significant sweetheart she'd ever had.
I mean, we were the couple, if you could call us. I mean, if you're talking about lesbian coupledoms.
It was a huge loss. Very much. Yeah, and I think Mary and I sometimes talk about how after Jane died, the relationships were more challenging than they had been.
Yeah, losing Jane, it set off an avalanche of kind of really really unfortunate interactions between my brother and I, Sally, my mom.
He was devastated by Jane's loss, that she was a really important person to him, but also very awkward around having the house left to him.
In a lot of ways, I would say it led to a fracturing of a lot of the original intent of what women's land was supposed to be.
How nice to be speaking from
a pulpit.
Sally didn't want the boys on the land. So Sally became more rigid than I've ever known her to be. I think Daniel was really heartbroken and perplexed about how to be a young man, respecting Sally's wishes and how to do this. He couldn't figure it out.
Jane's, written intent to leave Terpsichore to my brother and I fought for that. Unfortunately, because I think, looking back at it at this point, ideally, I wouldn't have fought for that, not that piece. I don't think we're there yet. I think we still need, unfortunately, more Sally-esque energy, kind of flag carrying at the extremes. This space is protected space for this group of people who are not yet sufficiently protected in our society.
Regularly now, women went to the remember rooms in the Cochleus to watch as remember guides rechanneled the old stories. More and more stories, more and more horrors. As a woman shared, she became a part of all of their history.
So what did you mean when you said the future is female?
I meant that women were going to be running things. That we're tired of this damn patriarchy that hasn't done anything but exploit other people. And we're ready for a women's world. Let's go, girls. Anything that stirs the heart in a positive way is possible for us all.
I hope you enjoyed that trailer. And again, I think what we're hoping to try to do is show a little bit of the tragedy of her final years and her isolation and her struggles, but also really powerfully show that we're going to try to show that people stepped up to support her in aging. And I don't think I mentioned that, but sadly she died last summer at age 90. But there are also a couple of objectives that we have in the film. So one, to recognize her. She's one more, as I mentioned, she's one more hidden figure. There's so many women, not to mention women of color and people of color, who haven't gotten the recognition they're due for their contributions, and our film hopes to remedy that. But we also feel very strongly that Sally is relevant today. Just as a person, she's captivating, she's funny, she's brilliant, and her life story shows this incredible transformation. I mean, that coming from the time and place that she came from, if she had done what everybody in the whole culture was telling her what to do, she would have maybe gone to college and then married and had children and stayed in Virginia. And instead, she just knew that wasn't for her and sought another path. The other thing is, so many of her key concerns are still relevant today. So if you heard her reading from her fantasy novel, The Wanderground there, and The Wanderground envisions a female utopia, a community of women that live together and also can communicate telepathically and have all these superpowers. But it also envisions the city of the world of men and violence against women. And her concern in the remember rooms is where women go to remember those violent experiences in an attempt to heal themselves. And of course, violence against women hasn't gone away, just count. You can more fingers. We don't have enough fingers to count the Bill Cosbys, the Harvey Weinsteins, and the Donald Trumps, and on and on. So that's absolutely still relevant today. Sally also really cared about environmental devastation, and she wrote about that in some of her fantasy novels and some of her other writings. But look, now here we are today. They weren't talking about climate change back in the 70s, but she sort of envisioned this, global cataclysm from not protecting the environment, and we're actually living that today with fires in California, flooding in Texas and Florida and so on. In fact, Sally at one point in the last 6 months of her life, she had to evacuate from her cabin because of fires nearby. And finally, Sally was somebody who really liked to stir things up. She liked to say controversial things like we should reduce men to 10% of the population, or I'm looking forward to the death of the church. So she liked to rile people up, but always with a sense of humor, self-deprecation, and she had this incredible ability to connect with people who are different from her. And so always this radicalism kind of combined with this overpowering urge to connect and to really love people, not to make enemies of people, but to fight for what was right. And here's a quick story that illustrates that. When she was fighting the Briggs Initiative, she was apparently at a very big rally speaking out against the Briggs Initiative. And people were cheering her on. And she said, if Briggs were here right now, what do you think I would do? And everybody's going, yeah, hoping she would say she was going to punch him in the chin or something. And she said instead, I would give him a big hug and a kiss on the lips. And that was Sally. Is I'm going to do battle with you, but really, it's not coming out of hatred. And later in her life, she also wrote something called Notes from a Recovering Activist, and it was all about not wanting to be an activist anymore, but really wanting to reach across the aisle. And I think really what it was is that she wanted to be an activist who did reach across the aisle. And we certainly need that spirit today, in this time of division that's so extreme that we can't even have a conversation where we agree to disagree so much of the time. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. Here are a few pictures of Sally that I love. On the left is her at her cabin, wearing a leather jacket and looking tough and laughing about it. And then to the right of that is her with Harvey Milk. To the right of that is another black and white picture of her in her cabin smoking a pipe. Again, she was an environmentalist who ate junk food and smoked for most of her life. And then on the right is Sally with two incredible gay rights pioneers, lesbian feminist activists, Phyllis and Dell. All right, so thank you again so much for watching and listening. If you have any questions, any feedback, any thoughts, there's my email. Thanks so much. Take care.